Maya wants to sacrifice me. You will hear in this video. A man discovers an ancient artifact that transports him back in time to the Maya civilization. Captured by the tribe, he's initially marked for sacrifice, but they interpret his arrival as a divine sign and spare him. Accepted into the tribe, he is haunted by nightmarish rituals, where blood and death are offerings to dark gods. The artifact, now revered by the Maya, becomes central to their ceremonies, but it harbors a dark secret. It demands a soul to sustain its power. As the man desperately seeks a way back to his own time, he realizes that the tribe intends to sacrifice him to the artifact. Trapped in a terrifying cycle, he faces a horrific choice: escape or become the next offering. Part 1. The Discovery. I've always known that obsession can drive a man to the brink, but I never imagined it would consume me completely, pulling me into a world where sanity teeters on the edge, waiting to collapse. My name is Evan Reese, and I'm an archaeologist, a seeker of the past, a hunter of forgotten histories. For years, the jungle had beckoned to me, its dense canopy concealing secrets that no man was ever meant to uncover. When I first heard about the artifact buried deep within the Yucatan, I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame, driven by an inexplicable need. What I thought was the thrill of discovery was, in truth, something far more sinister. A call from the unknown, leading me toward a darkness I couldn't fathom. The day began like many others in the jungle. Humid, oppressive, the air thick with the mingling sense of decay and life. I had been trekking for hours, my machete cutting through the underbrush, each step carrying me deeper into the heart of this verdant labyrinth. My guide, a local named Miguel, had warned me about the place, his eyes wide with fear as he spoke of the ancient spirits guarding the temple. I dismissed his words as superstition, laughing off what I considered the ramblings of an uneducated man. Now, I wish I had heeded his warning. The temple emerged from the jungle suddenly, as if the foliage had decided to reveal its secret. One moment, there were only trees and vines. The next, it stood before me, a towering structure of stone, weathered by time but still imposing, its surface covered in strange carvings that seemed to writhe and shift in the dappled light. A chill crept down my spine, my senses heightened as I approached. There was something profoundly wrong about this place, a palpable tension that made the very air hum with an unnatural energy. But I was too far gone, too consumed by my obsession to turn back. I stepped inside, swallowed by the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like the tang of blood. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, revealing grotesque figures engaged in what appeared to be ritualistic acts of violence. My stomach churned, but I pressed on, my footsteps echoing in the silence. And then I saw it, the artifact. It was small, barely the size of my palm, yet it radiated a power I could feel deep in my bones. Made of a dark, glossy material, its surface was smooth except for the intricate designs etched into it, spirals and shapes that seemed to draw the eye inward, pulling you into their depths. My hand trembled as I reached out, and the moment my fingers brushed its surface, the world around me shattered. I was falling, the ground disappearing beneath my feet, darkness closing in from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tumbled through the void. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with shock. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I found myself lying on the cold stone floor of a chamber, the walls adorned with the same carvings that had marked the temple. But this was no ruin. The stone was smooth and polished, the air warm and thick with the scent of burning incense. Dim light from torches mounted on the walls cast flickering shadows that danced in the corners of the room. I pushed myself to my feet, my body aching, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had I blacked out? Was this some kind of hallucination? Before I could make sense of it, I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. Panic surged through me, my heart racing as I searched for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps grew louder, and then they were in the room with me. I turned, my blood running cold. 3 figures stood in the doorway, their bodies painted with strange symbols, their eyes dark and cold as they stared at me. They were dressed in elaborate garments, feathers and bones woven into their hair, their skin glistening with sweat. One of them, taller than the others, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife strapped to his waist. He spoke in a language I didn't understand, his voice low and menacing, the words thick with malice. I tried to speak, to explain that I meant no harm, but my throat was dry, the words catching in my mouth. The man's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening around the knife's hilt. He said something else, and the 2 others moved toward me, their expressions void of emotion. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but they were too fast. They grabbed me, their grip ironclad, and dragged me out of the chamber. The corridor was long and narrow, the walls closing in on me as they pulled me along. My mind reeled, fear gripping me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I had traveled back in time. There was no other explanation. The artifact had somehow transported me to the past, to a time when this temple was still in use. But how? And why? I was thrown to the ground, my knees scraping against the rough stone. I looked up to find myself in a large chamber, the walls lined with torches that cast an eerie glow over the scene. In the center of the room was an altar stained with dark, dried blood. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what this was, a place of sacrifice. The tall man stepped forward, his knife gleaming in the torchlight. He raised it high, his eyes locked on mine, and I knew then that I was going to die. This was it, the end of the line. But just as the knife began its descent, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. The man froze, the blade inches from my throat. He turned, his expression darkening as he looked at the figure who had just entered the room. She was older, her face lined with age, her hair streaked with gray. But there was a power in her eyes, a wisdom that made the others step back in deference. She spoke to the man, her voice firm, and after a moment he lowered the knife, his jaw clenched in frustration. The woman stepped closer, her gaze piercing as she studied me. I couldn't understand their words, but it was clear she held authority. She spoke again, and the man nodded reluctantly, stepping aside. The 2 men who had dragged me here grabbed me once more, but this time their grip was less aggressive, more controlled. They pulled me to my feet, and the woman gestured for them to follow her. We walked in silence, the woman leading us through a maze of corridors, each more oppressive than the last. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Had she saved me? Or was she simply delaying the inevitable? My heart pounded, my throat dry as I tried to suppress the rising panic. Finally, we arrived at a large door, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The woman pushed it open, revealing a small chamber bathed in the soft glow of candles. In the center of the room was a stone slab, and resting on it was the artifact, the same one that had brought me here. The woman gestured for me to sit, and I hesitated for a moment before complying. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and then began to speak, her voice low and measured. As she spoke, she picked up the artifact, turning it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the carvings. I couldn't understand her words, but there was a rhythm to them, a cadence that resonated deep within me. My fear began to ebb, replaced by a strange sense of calm. She placed the artifact back on the slab and looked at me, her eyes searching mine. For a moment it felt as if she could see into my very soul, her gaze piercing the deepest corners of my mind. And then she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. She turned and left the room, the door closing behind her with a heavy thud. I was alone, the flickering candlelight casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. My heart was still racing, but my mind was clearer now, the initial shock beginning to wear off. I had been spared, but for what purpose? The woman's smile lingered in my thoughts, a haunting reminder that I was not safe. The artifact still lay on the slab, its dark surface glinting in the candlelight. I reached out to touch it, but something held me back, a deep primal fear that warned me not to. Instead, I sat back, my mind racing with questions. What was this place? Why had I been brought here? And most importantly, how was I going to survive in a world that was not my own? Part 2. The Captive. The days blurred into a continuous haze, each moment melding into the next in a cacophony of fear and confusion. I was confined to the chamber, the door rarely opening except to deliver meager rations, hardly food, just a tasteless mush that did little to quell the gnawing hunger in my gut. My captors, the tall man and his companions, observed me with eyes devoid of pity, their expressions cold and impassive. The woman who had spared me never returned. Her absence was a constant, a stark reminder that I was a pawn in a game I barely understood. I spent my time pacing the small room, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls, trying to come to terms with my new reality. The artifact, resting on its stone slab, seemed to watch me with a malign intelligence, its surface dark and unyielding, as if it were waiting for something, or someone. On the fourth night, I heard the chanting. It began softly, a distant murmur that grew louder and more insistent as the hours passed. The sound was unsettling, an eerie melody that seeped through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold, damp shroud. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the flickering shadows cast by the lone candle that lit my cell. But sleep eluded me, my mind plagued by the haunting echoes of the chant. When the chanting finally stopped, the silence that followed was oppressive, as if the very air had become thick with dread. I could hear the scurrying of unseen creatures in the darkness, their movements echoing through the stone corridors. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and I shivered despite the warmth of the room. The door creaked open, and I looked up to see the tall man standing there, flanked by two others. His face was inscrutable, but there was a glint in his eyes, anticipation perhaps, or malice. Without a word, he motioned for me to follow. I hesitated, the fear of the unknown holding me in place, but the stern look in his eyes left no room for argument. I was led through a labyrinth of corridors, each turn taking me deeper into the heart of the temple. The walls were lined with grotesque carvings, depicting scenes of ritualistic sacrifice and unspeakable horrors. The flickering torchlight cast grotesque shadows that seemed to dance and writhe, creating an almost hypnotic effect that quickened my heartbeat. We arrived at a large chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow, the air heavy with the smell of incense and something metallic and bitter. The chamber was dominated by an altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Surrounding the altar were figures in elaborate costumes, their faces painted with terrifying symbols, their eyes gleaming with malevolent light. In the center of the room stood the woman who had spared me. She was now dressed in ceremonial garb, her presence commanding and formidable. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a shiver of recognition mixed with dread. She began to speak, her voice rising and falling in a rhythmic chant that seemed to resonate through my very bones. The tall man and the others stepped aside, making way for me to approach the altar. I was pushed forward, my legs trembling, my heart pounding as I neared the blood-stained surface. The woman's eyes never left me, her gaze intense and unwavering. She gestured for me to kneel, her hand moving with an authority that left no room for disobedience. As I knelt before the altar, the chanting grew louder, the sound enveloping me like a physical presence. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, the noise building to a deafening crescendo. The figures around the altar began to sway, their movements synchronized in a ritualistic dance that seemed to blur the line between reality and nightmare. The tall man approached, holding a ceremonial knife that glinted ominously in the torchlight. My breath caught in my throat as he raised it high, the blade catching the flickering light and casting eerie reflections on the walls. The woman's chanting reached a fever pitch, her voice rising in a haunting melody that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. I was paralyzed with fear, my body refusing to move as the tall man positioned himself above me. The blade descended slowly, and I could feel the cool metal against my skin. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable, but instead of pain, I felt a strange warmth spreading through me, both terrifying and oddly comforting. The chanting abruptly stopped, and the chamber fell into an eerie silence. The tall man lowered the knife, his expression one of confusion and frustration. The woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me, her gaze piercing and inscrutable. She spoke in a low, commanding tone, and the tall man reluctantly stepped back, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The woman's gaze softened, and she approached me with graceful, deliberate movements. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. Her eyes held a mixture of pity and something else, something I couldn't quite place. She spoke again, her voice a soothing balm against the chaos that had consumed me. For a moment I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps she had intervened to save me from a fate worse than death. But as she turned and walked away, leaving me alone once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another layer of the nightmare. A reprieve, perhaps, but not a release. The artifact still lay in the shadows, its dark surface reflecting the flickering torchlight, a constant reminder that I was still a prisoner in a world that was both ancient and profoundly alien. The silence in the chamber was broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling, each drop echoing through the emptiness. I sank to the floor, my mind reeling from the events of the night. What did it all mean? Why had I been spared? And what role did the artifact play in this dark drama? As I sat there, my thoughts swirling in a maelstrom of fear and confusion, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only at the beginning of something far more sinister, something that would test the very limits of my sanity and force me to confront the darkest corners of my soul. Part 3. Rituals of the Damned. The days bled into nights, each one a torturous cycle of dread and disorientation. My existence in the temple had settled into a nightmarish routine. I was fed just enough to keep me alive, my captors' intentions as opaque as their stony expressions. I could do little more than endure, my days spent in the oppressive confines of my cell, and my nights plagued by the ceaseless, haunting whispers of ritualistic chants that seeped through the walls. One evening, after an interminable period of waiting, I was led once more through the winding corridors of the temple. This time, however, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, an electric charge that set my nerves on edge. The tall man and his two companions flanked me, their silent presence a constant, foreboding reminder of the fate that awaited me. We arrived at a massive stone door, adorned with elaborate carvings that seemed to writhe and contort in the flickering torchlight. The tall man pushed it open, and a stench overpowered me, an acrid mix of burnt flesh, incense, and something metallic and unsettling. My stomach lurched, but I forced myself to remain calm, though fear gnawed at my insides. Inside was a vast chamber, its walls adorned with grotesque murals depicting scenes of human sacrifice and dark rites. The floor was slick with something I dreaded to identify, and the center of the room was dominated by a large stone altar, stained dark with old blood. The flickering torchlight played tricks on my eyes, making the shadows dance and twist in horrifying ways. The chamber was filled with figures in ceremonial garb, their faces painted with grim, elaborate symbols. They moved with fluid grace, swaying to an unseen rhythm as they chanted in a language that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. The sound was mesmerizing, a deep, resonant drone that seemed to draw me into its dark embrace. As I was pushed forward, I was struck by the intense gaze of the high priestess, the woman who had intervened before. Her eyes burned with a cold, otherworldly fire, and she was surrounded by acolytes who moved with synchronized precision. Their movements were almost hypnotic, their eyes empty and unseeing as they chanted their ancient incantations. Forced to kneel before the altar, the cold stone pressed against my knees. The high priestess began her incantation, her voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence that seemed to resonate with the very heartbeat of the temple. She approached me, her expression one of focused intensity, and performed a series of intricate gestures with her hands. The air grew heavier, the pressure building until it felt as though I were being suffocated by the darkness that surrounded me. The acolytes joined in, their chanting growing louder, more insistent. The sound was almost unbearable, the vibrations resonating through my bones. My heart raced, each beat a drumroll of impending doom as the high priestess raised her arms high, holding a ceremonial dagger that glinted menacingly in the torchlight. I could hardly breathe as the dagger drew closer, its blade sharp and cold. The priestess's eyes locked onto mine, her gaze piercing and unyielding. Her chant grew more fervent, each word a dagger aimed at my sanity. The tension was palpable, the ritual reaching a fever pitch as the room seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching and writhing as if alive. Just as the blade was about to descend, a sudden chilling wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the torches and plunging us into darkness. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence that seemed to reverberate with the echoes of lost souls. The high priestess's voice was the only sound cutting through the darkness, her words filled with urgency and dread. The darkness was suffocating, a living, breathing entity pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear the rustle of fabric, the soft, hurried whispers of the acolytes moving through the inky blackness. My breathing quickened, panic rising in my chest as I struggled to make sense of the sudden turn of events. A beam of light pierced the darkness as the high priestess's voice rose in a desperate, incantatory cry. The torches flared back to life, casting a harsh, flickering light over the chamber. The scene before me was even more terrifying than before. The altar was now smeared with a fresh layer of blood, the floor slick and red, and the acolytes stood in tense, fearful silence. The high priestess's gaze was fixed on the artifact, which lay on a raised pedestal, bathed in an eerie, supernatural light. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and reverence as she approached it, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch its dark surface. The air around the artifact seemed to shimmer, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The high priestess lifted the artifact, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of chanting and noise, the acolytes moving in frantic circles as the high priestess held the artifact aloft, its dark power resonating through the chamber. The energy was palpable, a suffocating force pressing in on me, making it difficult to breathe. As the ritual reached its climax, the chamber was filled with a blinding light, and the world seemed to tilt and warp around me. The high priestess's voice rose in a piercing scream, the sound cutting through the chaos like a knife. I felt a jolt, as if the very ground beneath me was shifting, and then everything went dark once more. When I awoke, I was back in my cell, the silence oppressive and absolute. My body ached, my mind reeling from the intensity of the experience. The artifact still lay in its place, its dark surface gleaming ominously in the dim light. The ritual had left me shaken, my nerves frayed and my sanity hanging by a thread. The high priestess's eyes haunted me, her gaze filled with an ancient, inscrutable power. The chamber's blood-stained altar, the chanting, the darkness, it all seemed to blend together into a nightmarish tapestry of terror. I knew that whatever the artifact was, it was far more than a mere relic. It was a key, a gateway to something dark and malevolent, and I was trapped in its insidious grip. As I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The artifact had awoken something ancient and powerful, and I was caught in its web, a mere pawn in a game of darkness and despair. Part 4. The Artifact's Curse. The days following the ritual blurred into a feverish haze of nightmares and fragmented reality. I could barely distinguish between the waking world and the phantasmagoric visions that haunted me. Each moment stretched into an endless loop of dread and paranoia, with the artifact looming as a constant dark presence. The Maya tribe's attitude toward me had shifted dramatically. The high priestess now regarded me with a mix of fear and reverence, while the other tribe members seemed increasingly apprehensive, their eyes darting nervously whenever they glimpsed me. The artifact, once a mere curiosity, had become the focal point of their rituals and whispered conversations. Its significance was clearly growing, and with it, my anxiety. One evening, I was summoned to the high priestess's quarters, a space that was both sacred and terrifying. The walls were adorned with ancient symbols and eerie, lifelike depictions of deities and spirits whose eyes seemed to follow my every movement. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something else, something that clung to the back of my throat and made it difficult to breathe. The high priestess was seated at a large stone altar, the artifact placed prominently before her. She was deep in contemplation, her expression a mix of intense concentration and fear. As I entered, Her gaze met mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of something, perhaps sympathy or pity, before she quickly masked it with her usual stern demeanor. She beckoned me forward with deliberate, precise movements. "The artifact," she began, her voice low and heavy with significance, "is not merely a relic of our ancestors. It is a vessel, a conduit to powers beyond our comprehension. It has a will of its own, a hunger that grows stronger with each passing day." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I had sensed the artifact's power, but hearing it described in such terms made its curse all too real. The High Priestess continued, her tone growing more ominous. "The artifact demands sacrifice. It has claimed many souls before yours, and it will not be sated until it has taken what it desires." I tried to speak, to ask questions, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind raced with the implications of her words. The High Priestess's gaze remained fixed on me, as if she were trying to gauge my reaction to this grim revelation. "There are those among us," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "who believe that you are to be the next offering. The artifact's curse has begun to manifest, and we are bound by ancient rites to appease it. Your fate is intertwined with its dark will." The weight of her words pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. I could feel the room closing in, the air growing thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to pulse with the artifact's dark power. My heart pounded, each beat a reminder of the peril I faced. The High Priestess reached for the artifact, her fingers brushing its surface with a reverence that was almost palpable. As she held it up, the room was bathed in an eerie, unearthly glow. The artifact's carvings seemed to come to life, the symbols shifting and writhing as if they were alive. "The artifact is ancient," the High Priestess continued, her voice trembling slightly, "and its curse is bound to the blood moon, a rare celestial event that occurs once every century. During this time, the veil between worlds is at its thinnest, and the artifact's power is at its peak." The words hung in the air like a dark omen. The blood moon, an event I had heard of but never fully understood, was imminent. The High Priestess's gaze was intense, filled with foreboding that sent chills down my spine. "The blood moon is a time of reckoning," she said. "It is when the artifact will demand its final sacrifice. You must prepare yourself, for the time of reckoning is fast approaching. The curse will claim its due, and there is no escaping its grasp." As she spoke, the artifact's dark energy seemed to surge, the room vibrating with a malevolent force. The High Priestess's words were a chilling reminder of the fate that awaited me, a fate that seemed increasingly inescapable with each passing day. I left her quarters in a daze, my mind a whirl of fear and confusion. The artifact's curse was no longer a distant threat, but a looming reality, and my role in its dark prophecy was becoming ever clearer. The tribe's rituals, the High Priestess's warnings, and the artifact's ominous power were all part of a nightmarish web tightening around me. The days leading up to the blood moon were a blur of tension and dread. The tribe's preparations grew more intense, the rituals more frequent, and the atmosphere charged with an almost palpable sense of impending doom. I was a prisoner not just of the Maya tribe, but of a curse that seeped into every corner of my existence. As the blood moon drew closer, I could feel the artifact's influence growing stronger, its dark power pressing in on me. The very air around me seemed to thrum with a sinister energy. The world was closing in, and the shadows of the past were creeping ever closer, threatening to engulf me in a maelstrom of horror and despair. The curse of the artifact was no longer a distant threat, but a terrifying reality. My fate seemed inexorably tied to the dark forces it had unleashed. The blood moon was on the horizon, and with it, the promise of an unspeakable horror that would test the very limits of my sanity and soul. Part 5. Whispers of the Dead. The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive with each passing day, a tangible weight of dread pressing down on me, making every breath a struggle. The blood moon loomed on the horizon, a dark omen casting its shadow over every aspect of my existence in the Maya village. The artifact's presence was a constant, malignant force, its dark energy palpable and suffocating. I was haunted by whispers, soft, insidious murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. These voices, though barely audible, were filled with an urgent, desperate quality that made my skin crawl. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their words fragmented and disjointed, but the tone was unmistakably filled with anguish and terror. Every night, as darkness enveloped the village, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to echo through the stone walls of my cell, wrapping around me like a cold, invisible hand. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to decipher their meaning as the whispers twisted and turned, each fragment a puzzle piece of a greater horror. On one particularly dark night, the whispers became more distinct. I could make out phrases in the fragmented voices, words like betrayal, sacrifice, and escape. They seemed to emanate from the depths of the temple, from a place that was both ancient and profoundly malevolent. The voices were accompanied by faint, ghostly wails that pierced the silence of the night, their mournful cries a chilling reminder of the souls lost to the artifact's curse. Unable to endure the incessant whispers any longer, I ventured out of my cell, driven by a desperate need to understand what was happening. The corridors of the temple were eerily quiet, the flickering torchlight casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. Each step I took seemed to reverberate through the silence, my footsteps merging with the ghostly whispers. I followed the voices through the labyrinthine passages, guided by an instinctual sense that they held the key to my understanding. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the temple, the temperature dropping as if the very walls were exuding a chill from some unseen source. The whispers grew more insistent, their urgency palpable as I approached a heavy, ornately carved door. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing a hidden chamber unlike any I had seen before. Dimly lit by a single flickering torch, the room was bathed in eerie, dancing shadows. At the center of the chamber stood an ancient stone altar, similar to the one in the main temple, but adorned with strange arcane symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight. Surrounding the altar were remnants of long-abandoned rituals, dried bloodstains, torn scraps of ceremonial garb, and scattered broken artifacts that hinted at dark, forgotten rites. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic blend of voices rising from the very stone of the chamber. I approached the altar cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The artifact lay atop it, its dark surface pulsating with a malevolent energy that seemed to resonate through the room. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as if the voices were pleading with me to do something, anything, to free them from their torment. As I reached out to touch the artifact, a sudden searing pain shot through my head. My vision blurred, and I was plunged into a whirlwind of chaotic, disjointed images. I glimpsed ancient rituals, the faces of long-dead Maya priests, and the anguished expressions of those who had been sacrificed. The images were accompanied by the chilling, sorrowful cries of souls trapped by the artifact's curse. The vision abruptly ended, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The whispers had ceased, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the chamber. The artifact's dark power pulsed with a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart, its energy and overwhelming force threatening to consume me. I staggered to my feet, my mind reeling from the experience. The whispers had revealed a terrible truth. The artifact was a prison, a vessel holding the souls of those sacrificed. Their anguish was bound to the artifact, their cries a constant reminder of the horror awaiting anyone who came into contact with it. As I left the chamber, the weight of the artifact's curse pressed down on me. The whispers had offered no answers, only a glimpse into the darkness that lay ahead. The blood moon was drawing closer, and with it, the artifact's power was growing stronger. The souls trapped within seemed to be reaching out, their torment a reflection of the fate that awaited me. The village was alive with preparations for the blood moon, the rituals growing more intense, and the atmosphere charged with a sense of impending doom. The whispers had revealed the artifact's true nature, but left me with more questions than answers. What was the artifact's true purpose? And what role was I destined to play in its dark prophecy? As the blood moon approached, I felt the noose tightening around me, the artifact's curse a looming shadow threatening to engulf my very soul. The whispers of the dead had offered a chilling glimpse into the horrors awaiting me, but had also ignited a desperate resolve within, a determination to confront the darkness and find a way to escape the cycle of horror that had ensnared me. Part 6. The blood moon. The blood moon loomed ever closer, casting an inescapable shadow over the village. The once familiar surroundings now seemed to pulse with a dark, palpable energy. The villagers moved with a grim, feverish intensity, their rituals growing more elaborate and frantic as the celestial event approached. The air was thick with an ominous sense of dread, each breath seeming to grow heavier as the night drew nearer. The night of the blood moon arrived, transforming the village into a place of eerie, crimson illumination. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, its blood-red hue casting a sinister glow over everything. Ritualistic fires had been kindled, their flames dancing with a wild, untamed energy that mirrored the growing tension among the villagers. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense, mingling with the acrid tang of something metallic and unsettling. The high priestess and her acolytes were at the center of the preparations, their movements a blur of frenetic activity. The ceremonial garments they wore were stained with fresh blood, the symbols etched into their clothing glowing with an unnatural, spectral light. Their chanting reached a fever pitch, a rhythmic cadence that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the village itself. I was led to the central altar, the same stone structure that had become a symbol of my impending doom. Now, it was adorned with grotesque offerings, freshly sacrificed animals, their blood pooling in macabre patterns. The air around the altar throbbed with a dark, malevolent energy, a reflection of the artifact's power and the imminent sacrifice. The high priestess approached, her face a mask of cold determination. She held the artifact, its dark surface gleaming ominously under the blood moon's light. Her gaze was fixed on me, devoid of any earlier fear or sympathy. Instead, her expression was one of grim acceptance, resigned to the dark role fate had cast for me. "The time has come," she intoned, her voice carrying a weight of finality. "The blood moon is upon us, and the artifact demands its due. Tonight the veil between worlds is thinnest, and the artifact's power reaches its peak. You are to be the offering, the vessel through which the artifact's curse will be fulfilled." Her words struck me like a physical blow, their gravity sinking into the very core of my being. The artifact, now resting on the altar, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its dark power resonating through the air. The high priestess's announcement was a chilling reminder of the fate that awaited me, a fate that seemed increasingly inescapable as the night wore on. As the high priestess began the final incantations, the village erupted into a frenzy. The villagers, their faces painted with symbols of dark power, moved in synchronized patterns around the altar. Their chanting crescendoed into a terrifying symphony of despair and anticipation, the ritualistic flames casting long, flickering shadows that danced across their faces. The high priestess raised her arms high, her voice a haunting, otherworldly chant that resonated with the very fabric of reality. The artifact, now on a raised pedestal, pulsed with a dark, sinister light, its energy growing stronger with each moment. The villagers joined in the chant, their voices blending into a terrifying chorus of fear and hopelessness. As the ritual reached its climax, the blood moon reached its zenith, casting an otherworldly glow over the scene. The high priestess approached the altar, her movements deliberate and precise. She lifted the artifact, its dark power resonating through the air, and placed it directly above my heart. The energy from the artifact surged, a palpable force that seemed to engulf me in its dark embrace. The room spun, shadows stretching and writhing as if alive. An intense pressure built within me, as though my very essence was being drawn out and pulled into the artifact's dark core. The high priestess's chant reached a deafening crescendo, her voice piercing the chaos. The villagers fell silent, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, as the artifact's power peaked. The atmosphere was charged with an almost unbearable intensity, a sense of impending doom pressing down on me from all sides. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the artifact, filling the chamber with a searing, otherworldly radiance. The force of the light was overwhelming, its intensity a physical sensation that seemed to tear through reality itself. The villagers recoiled, their faces etched with horror and disbelief. The high priestess's voice was lost in the blinding light, her form becoming a mere silhouette against the artifact's dark glow. The chamber was filled with a cacophony of sounds, the roar of the flames, the cries of the villagers, and the relentless pulse of the artifact's dark energy. The world seemed to warp and twist around me, reality dissolving into a chaotic maelstrom of light and shadow. As the light began to fade, I was left with a profound sense of emptiness and disorientation. The artifact's power had surged through me, leaving me a mere vessel for its dark will. The villagers, their expressions a mix of awe and horror, watched in stunned silence as the blood moon's light receded, and the chamber returned to its oppressive darkness. The ritual was over, but its effects were far from finished. The artifact's curse had claimed its due, and I was left to grapple with the aftermath of its dark power. The blood moon had passed, but its influence lingered, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had been unleashed. The night was over, but the true horror had only begun. The artifact's curse now resided within me, a malignant force that promised to continue its cycle of terror and despair. The blood moon had cast its shadow, and I was left to confront the chilling reality of my fate, bound to the artifact's curse and trapped in a nightmarish cycle of darkness and horror. Part 7. The Escape. The morning after the blood moon was a cruel mockery of serenity. The sun rose with an indifference that felt almost obscene, casting a brilliant light over a village still reeling from the night's horrors. The village was in disarray, the fires of the previous night's ritual reduced to smoldering embers. The villagers moved about with a resigned sense of duty, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. The blood moon's climax had passed, but the darkness it had unleashed was far from over. With the artifact's curse now a palpable presence within me, I knew my time was running out. The chilling realization that I was not only a prisoner of the Maya tribe, but also a vessel for an ancient evil spurred me into action. Desperation fueled my resolve as I made the decision to flee. I had to escape, if only to buy myself a chance to survive. The village bustled with activity, but the true focus of the tribe was on the aftermath of the ritual. I used this distraction to my advantage, slipping through the shadows and making my way toward the edge of the settlement. The dense jungle surrounding the village was both a barrier and a potential escape route, its treacherous paths promising both danger and freedom. As I entered the jungle, the oppressive atmosphere of the village was replaced by an equally stifling sense of isolation. The canopy above was a thick curtain of leaves and branches, filtering sunlight into a dim, greenish haze. The air was heavy with humidity and the scent of decay, the jungle a living entity that seemed to pulsate with an unsettling rhythm. The jungle was a maze of twisted vines and gnarled roots, each step feeling like a deeper descent into a nightmarish labyrinth. The whispers of the artifact's curse seemed to follow me, a constant, haunting presence in the back of my mind. The deeper I ventured, the more the jungle seemed to close in around me, its darkness a physical sensation that clung to my skin. The jungle's sounds were a cacophony of life and death, chirps, rustles, and distant cries from unseen creatures. Amid these natural noises were others, soft, insidious sounds suggesting I was not alone. The whispers of the artifact grew louder, their urgency almost palpable. I stumbled upon ancient ruins hidden beneath a thick layer of jungle growth. The crumbling stone structures, covered in moss and vines, were shadows of their former grandeur. The ruins resonated with a sense of foreboding, their presence a stark reminder of the past's lingering influence. Among the ruins, I found skeletal remains, evidence of those who had ventured here before me, perhaps victims of the artifact's curse or failed escape attempts. Their twisted, decomposed forms were a chilling testament to the jungle's merciless nature. The sight of these remains, coupled with the artifact's whispers, drove me to the brink of panic. My sense of direction faltered, the jungle's disorienting maze causing me to lose my bearings. Every path seemed to lead deeper into the ruins, walls and structures closing in like a tomb. The whispers grew louder, a haunting chorus that mocked every attempt at escape. In a moment of desperation, I pushed through a dense thicket and emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood a stone altar, similar to the village's but in worse condition. The altar was covered in eldritch carvings that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. The air around it was thick with oppressive energy, and I could feel the artifact's dark power resonating from it. As I approached the altar, I saw it adorned with offerings, dried, twisted remnants of ritualistic sacrifices. The sight was nauseating, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. I needed to escape the jungle and the artifact's influence. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl pierced the air, coming from all around me. I spun around, heart racing, and saw shadows moving at the periphery of the clearing. The jungle was alive with unseen threats, its darkness concealing predators drawn to the scent of fear. In a frantic bid for survival, I darted away from the clearing, pushing through the thick underbrush with renewed urgency. The whispers of the artifact were now a constant, tormenting presence, urging me to keep moving, to escape the encroaching darkness. The jungle closed in around me, shadows growing darker and sounds more menacing. The artifact's curse was relentless, its influence a dark cloud pressing in on my senses. The whispers were a frenzied cacophony, their voices blending into a nightmarish sound that drove me to the edge of madness. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I emerged at the edge of a precipice. Below, a river's dark waters swirled and churned with a foreboding energy. The sight was both a relief and a new source of terror. Escaping into the river meant facing its dangerous currents, but it also offered a chance at freedom. With no other options, I plunged into the river, the cold water enveloping me like a shroud. The fierce currents pulled me downstream, threatening to sweep me away. The jungle's darkness receded as I was carried further from the village, but the artifact's curse remained a dark presence clinging to my very soul. As the river carried me toward an uncertain fate, I could only hope that I had evaded the Maya tribe's immediate grasp. The artifact's curse was far from over, but for now, I had managed to escape its immediate influence. The jungle's horrors were behind me, but the artifact's shadow still loomed large, a dark reminder of the terror that awaited me. Part 8. The Temple of Doom. The river's relentless current battered me through jagged rocks and churning waters. By the time I staggered onto the riverbank, I was disoriented and exhausted, my body marked by the river's harsh embrace. The jungle loomed around me, its silence a stark contrast to the chaotic rush of the river. As I pushed through the underbrush, every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a potential threat. The whispers of the artifact's curse were a constant haunting presence, weaving through my thoughts and amplifying my sense of impending doom. I had escaped the Maya tribe's immediate grasp, but the artifact's dark power was far from vanquished. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows, I stumbled upon a ridge that revealed an imposing structure, partially concealed by the jungle's relentless growth. The temple, a crumbling giant of stone and ruin, rose from the foliage like the skeletal remains of a forgotten beast. The air around it was thick with an unnatural chill, and I could feel the artifact's power pulsing from the structure, a palpable force that made my skin crawl. The temple's entrance yawned open, a gaping maw of darkness framed by grotesque carvings and faded frescoes depicting scenes of ancient rituals and sacrifices. The sight of it filled me with a profound sense of dread, but the whispers of the artifact urged me forward, their desperation a chilling reminder of the curse that had become my own. Hesitating at the threshold, I steeled myself and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cool and musty, carrying the faint, acrid scent of decay. The interior of the temple was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and vast, echoing chambers. The torchlight I carried flickered across walls covered in ancient glyphs and symbols, their meanings obscured by the passage of time. Shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, shifting and writhing in the dim light. As I ventured deeper, I entered a grand chamber dominated by a massive, ominous altar. The altar, covered in bloodstains and adorned with arcane symbols pulsing with an otherworldly light, radiated a palpable sense of foreboding. The whispers grew louder, their voices a frantic cacophony of anguish and fear emanating from the altar itself. Approaching the altar, my heart pounded in my chest. The artifact's dark power was a tangible presence, its energy radiating from the altar like a malevolent force. The whispers seemed to coalesce around it, rising in a desperate chorus that filled the chamber with a sense of impending doom. A deep, resonant gong suddenly echoed through the temple, its sound reverberating through the stone walls and shaking the very foundations. The chamber was bathed in a dim, reddish light, casting long, eerie shadows that writhed and twisted. The high priestess and her acolytes emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by ceremonial masks. They chanted in an unknown language, their voices blending into a haunting melody that filled the chamber with a hypnotic rhythm. The air charged with a dark ritualistic energy, resonating with the artifact's curse. The high priestess approached the altar, her eyes fixed on the artifact with grim determination. She lifted the artifact, its dark surface gleaming ominously in the chamber's light. The artifact's energy surged, pulsing with a life of its own. The priests began to move in a circle around the altar, their chants growing louder and more frenzied. The chamber's temperature dropped, the air thickening with a sense of foreboding. The artifact's power intensified, its dark energy radiating outward in violent pulses. The high priestess raised the artifact high, her chant reaching a climactic pitch that seemed to pierce reality itself. The air crackled with energy, the artifact's power reaching its zenith. The chamber was filled with a blinding, searing light as the artifact's curse manifested in a destructive surge. Amid the chaos, I was overwhelmed by an intense sense of dread. The artifact's power was beyond comprehension, a dark presence threatening to consume everything. The chamber seemed to warp and twist, the walls closing in as if the very temple was collapsing around me. Desperate to escape, I darted away from the altar, my movements frantic and erratic. The temple's labyrinthine corridors became a blur of shifting shadows and oppressive darkness, the whispers of the artifact's curse a relentless torment. The temple's ancient, malevolent energy pressed in from all sides, the stone walls pulsing with the artifact's power. The chamber I had left was a place of unfathomable horror, its dark energy a grim reminder of the evil within the temple's depths. Finally, I emerged from the temple, the oppressive darkness giving way to the faint light of dawn. The jungle stood as a silent witness to the horrors that had transpired, its dense foliage a barrier between me and the malevolent force that had been unleashed. The temple's ominous presence loomed in the distance, a dark shadow that seemed to follow me with every step. As I fled deeper into the jungle, the artifact's curse remained an inescapable presence. The horrors of the temple had deepened my sense of dread and despair, the darkness and the artifact's malevolent power a grim reality that promised further terror and suffering. Part 9. The Ultimate Sacrifice. Dawn brought no relief, only a harsh reminder of the nightmare that had become my reality. The jungle, once a refuge, now seemed like an impenetrable maze of shadows and lurking dangers. My escape from the temple had left me disoriented and on the brink of collapse. Each step through the dense foliage felt like wading through a swamp of despair, the weight of the artifact's curse growing heavier with every moment. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows through the thick canopy, I stumbled upon a hauntingly familiar sight. The Maya village, now eerily silent. The vibrant hub of activity had turned into a ghostly echo, its fires extinguished and its usual bustle replaced by a foreboding stillness. It was as if the village itself had been holding its breath, anticipating the inevitable. My heart raced with a mix of dread and disbelief as I approached the village's heart. The altar, a grim beacon of my impending doom, stood once more in the center of the village. The villagers, their faces obscured by haunting masks, moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. Their eyes, cold and unfeeling, tracked my every movement, their silence more terrifying than any noise. The high priestess commanded the gathering with an authoritative presence. She held the artifact aloft, its dark energy radiating a menacing aura. The blood moon, fully risen and casting a deep, unsettling red glow, seemed to herald the final act of this macabre drama. The villagers gathered around the altar, their expressions a mix of reverence and cold detachment. The ritualistic chants began, their rhythm a haunting, almost hypnotic drone that filled the air with a sense of impending doom. The atmosphere was charged with dark energy, the artifact's influence casting a pervasive shadow over the proceedings. Forcibly led to the altar, my struggles felt weak and futile against the tribe's unyielding grip. The artifact, now glowing with an otherworldly light, was positioned above my heart, its dark power palpable and insatiable. The high priestess chanted in an incomprehensible language, her voice rising in a crescendo of malevolent intent. The blood moon cast a blood-red hue over the scene, its light filtering through the canopy and creating eerie shadows that danced in the flickering torchlight. The village's silence was a heavy shroud, pierced only by the relentless chanting and the rhythmic pounding of drums. The very air seemed to vibrate with the artifact's dark energy, pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. The High Priestess's chant reached a fever pitch, her voice echoing with otherworldly intensity. The villagers, their faces hidden behind ancient masks, chanted in unison, their voices merging into a chilling melody. The ground beneath the altar seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the artifact's dark power surging in a violent maelstrom. As the ritual climaxed, a sudden, blinding light erupted from the artifact, flooding the village with a searing, otherworldly radiance. The light was overwhelming, its intensity blinding and oppressive. The villagers recoiled, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and terror as the artifact's power reached its peak. In the midst of the blinding light, I felt an intense, searing pain as the artifact's dark energy surged through me. The light seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, its power a destructive force threatening to consume everything. The pain was indescribable, a torment that reached into the depths of my soul and threatened to break me. The High Priestess's voice, now a haunting scream, cut through the chaos. The artifact's light began to fade, its power receding and leaving behind a suffocating darkness. The villagers fell silent, their eyes wide with a blend of fear and awe as the ritual concluded. The darkness that followed was a heavy, oppressive blanket, the village now an alien, foreboding place. The artifact's curse had been fulfilled, its dark power now a part of the village's legacy. The High Priestess's gaze met mine, her eyes a cold void reflecting the artifact's insatiable hunger. As the ritual concluded, the artifact's dark power settled into me, a malignant presence promising to endure beyond the night. The blood moon's light faded, leaving behind a profound silence more terrifying than any noise. The village, now a desolate and haunted place, stood as a grim monument to the artifact's influence. The finality of the ritual left me with a chilling realization. The artifact's curse was not a fleeting presence but an enduring force. The blood moon had cast its shadow, and I was left grappling with the dark legacy that had been unleashed. The darkness of the village and the artifact's malevolent power were now an inseparable part of my existence, a grim reminder of the terror that awaited. Part 10. Echoes of Eternity. Morning broke with a heavy, mournful silence. The village, now a grim tableau of desolation, bore the marks of the night's horrors. The remnants of the ritual lay scattered, a macabre array of debris that spoke of the dark ceremony's culmination. The once familiar landscape had turned into a bleak, forsaken wasteland, a stark testament to the artifact's curse. I awoke on the altar, my body numb, and my mind clouded by the aftermath of the ritual. The blood moon's light had faded, leaving behind a dull, gray pallor that seemed to deepen the silence. The artifact, a dark, pulsating mass of malevolent energy, lay beside me. Its presence was a constant torment, a cruel reminder of its insatiable hunger and dark power. Every attempt to rise was met with searing pain, a brutal reminder of the artifact's influence. This pain was more than physical. It seemed to reach into my soul, a relentless torment that left me gasping. The artifact's curse was not just a dark force, but a consuming void that sought to devour everything in its path. The village was eerily silent, its once vibrant life replaced by an oppressive stillness. Structures and artifacts, left as silent witnesses, bore the scars of the night's terror. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, a palpable energy that hinted at the darkness that had been unleashed. Wandering through the village, I encountered the remnants of the ritual, blood-stained altars, discarded offerings, and twisted relics of ancient evil. Each sight was a stark reminder of the darkness that had been unleashed, a grim tableau of horrors that now marked my reality. The artifact's curse was pervasive, extending beyond the village and embedding itself into my very existence. The whispers that had once been distant echoes were now a constant torment, their voices a cacophony of anguish and despair. These whispers resonated with the artifact's dark energy, creating a relentless, tormenting presence. As night fell, the village was bathed in a ghostly, ethereal light. The remnants of the blood moon's glow cast eerie shadows across the landscape, amplifying the oppressive energy that filled the air. The artifact's power was palpable, a dark force that pulsed with an insatiable hunger. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant echoes of the artifact's curse. The once familiar landscape had become a nightmarish realm where the boundaries of reality and darkness had blurred. The artifact's power had become a permanent fixture in my life, a dark presence that would follow me beyond the village and into the unknown. As I looked out over the desolate village, I realized my fate was inextricably linked to the artifact's curse. The blood moon's light had faded, but the darkness it had wrought remained a constant, unyielding force. The artifact was a relic of ancient evil, its power enduring beyond the night's end. The echoes of the blood moon's ritual served as a chilling reminder of the terror that had become my reality. The village, now a silent witness, stood as a grim monument to the artifact's dark influence. The darkness of the night and the artifact's malevolent power were now inseparable from my existence, a reminder of the endless cycle of horror and despair. In the end, the artifact's curse was not a fleeting presence, but an enduring force, following me into the void between time and reality. The echoes of the blood moon were a haunting, eternal reminder of the terror unleashed, a dark legacy that would persist long after the night had ended. So, my friends, that's the end of the story. You can go to my playlist and see many more interesting, scary stories.